welcome to our first session of whole Zoom sessions for, I kept wanting to say spring or autumn, and then I realized that I can't do that because in different parts of the world, the seasons are completely different. So we're very happy to welcome for this series, Mark Wade, who's the creator and producer of Legends and Legacies. So Mark was born in Durban of French, Mauritian, and South African parents, studied art and design at the Durban Technikon and filmmaking at the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. Started his film career in the ink and paint studio of Kurtz and Friends, one of Hollywood's leading independent animation studios in the 1970s, and then progressed to be an art director and assistant director on numerous films, TV series, and TV commercials. Creating Legends and Legacies was his first venture at producing, a responsibility, he says, he went into with not quite realizing what it meant. Running a production is quite different to being a crew member. Fortunately, the team I put together was very supportive. Mark has 3 other Jewish-themed documentary series in development. On the hunt for funding, that he says is the most challenging part of making films. Now, Mark was very fortunate to find Alan Swerdlow, who has written and who delivers the scripts on these amazing films. Alan is a Joburger and completed his postgraduate studies at the University of Cape Town's Little Theatre and has acted, written, and directed for most of the theatrical managements in South Africa. He's one of the most highly acclaimed theatre directors there and also a theatre historian. And as we can see from what he's going to do for us, he's a real historian of South African Jewish communities. He was a member of the Market Theatre, putting it on the road to world recognition. And from there, he moved to the Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal, South African Broadcasting Corporation, and to Peter Turian's company as one of his principal directors. So that's our team. And I'm now going to hand over to Mark to introduce his amazing series of 8 films on the history of Jewish communities in South Africa. So Mark, what made you do it?
Gee, that's a story that now goes back about 7 years. So anyway, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me and welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy it. My wife's father's family were refugees from Rhodes Island in Greece. There were Sephardis who came here during World War II to South Africa, having been chased out by first the Italian black shirts and then the Nazis, and they were fortunate to get out of the country, and they came to Southern Africa. So I started researching them and seeing who they are, and then I wanted to look at the greater Jewish community in South Africa and realized that there were quite a few books written, but there was no TV series, that you could click on a link and start watching something. So I started developing this TV series. It really just was a kind of an overnight thought. And the thought just got bigger and bigger. And then I realized that, I could never make this production without raising the money and without finding the right people. And fortunately, I found Nati Kirsch, and Nati was very keen to fund the production, and I'm eternally grateful to him, and I hope our community is too. So we broke up the series and realized it was going to be 8 episodes, and we haven't created it in chronological order. We rather did each episode thematically. So, the first episode is who were they, where did they come from? Second episode is integration into the communities, and so on and so on. So we started talking about the politicians and the people in the arts and entertainment, and we created, as I said, themes for each episode. So although the 8 episodes take us through, it's an 8-hour-long production, it's quite a handful to watch, and it really is packed with information. And I must say the South Africa's Jewish community has an absolutely fascinating history. And almost every one of the Jews who arrived here were refugees from somewhere. Except the early days when the first Jew to settle here was a ship surgeon on a British ship in about 1807. And since then, the community has grown and grown. The early days, there were mostly British Jews who came here with as British colonialists, and then towards the latter part of the 19th century, then there was the Litvaks who were escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe. And then it was only really during World War II that the Sephardis arrived in South Africa. So what we're going to show you, for the first episode we're going to show you is episode 4, which really is the community now becoming very, very involved with the local South African community. They've become established. The communal organizations have all been set up, and they're now becoming part of society, whether they're becoming mayors, which, funny enough, there were many, but they're now engaging with the greater South African community. And I said we're going into episode 4. We thought the episode 1, 2, and 3 would probably be information that most of you know, their history, who they were, where they came from, the establishment of the schools, the shuls, the community organizations, and then going into the institutions, the Jewish Board of Deputies, etc. So those first 3 episodes, I think a lot of you probably know most of that, but now we'll go into what this episode is called It All Depends. And you'll see how the community now engages with the broader South African society. Would you like me to share the screen and show it?
It looks vaguely Egyptian, doesn't it? But it should do. It's even called the Egyptian building. Moses wasn't here, though plenty of Jews were. Built in 1839, when Egyptomania was all the rage in England, largely as a byproduct of the Napoleonic Wars and the acquisition of the Rosetta Stone by the British Museum, this was the first official building of the South African College, the high school that was to become the University of Cape Town. It remains the oldest building in use on the university's campuses. The roll call of notable self-identifying Jews who subscribed in 1829 and became foundation shareholders included Dr. Siegfried Frankl, the ship's surgeon who had made Cape Town his new home, Isaac Manuel, and Maximilian Thelwitzer, the Sheep King. Nearly a century later, the students of UCT were given the nickname Ikeys by the rival University of Stellenbosch, largely because of the high percentage of Jewish enrollment. Jewish involvement in civil society in South Africa began early. One of the first students at the South African College was young Saul Solomon, sent to Cape Town at age 12 from St. Helena Island by his family expressly to study. His uncle, also Saul Solomon, was the sheriff of St. Helena, representative of the British administration. It appears to have been a strong and remarkable family. Nathaniel Isaacs of Sharker's chicken soup fame was also a cousin. Most of the family ended up in Cape Town, and Saul Jr. rose to become a leading member of the Cape Legislature. He was also apprenticed when young to a printer, a Mr. Gregg of St. George's Street, and together with his younger brother Henry, they eventually purchased the printing business and scooped the contract to print the Government Gazette in addition to other government documents. 15 years later, they became the printers of the Cape Argus and later became the proprietors of the highly esteemed and influential newspaper, Saul managing to balance being a member of Parliament and a member of the Fourth Estate with little difficulty. In the field of journalism before Saul Solomon, a Sephardic Jew from the Netherlands, one Joseph Swasso de Lima, had published a Dutch newspaper in Cape Town called De Verzamelaar, the Collector. Solomon's story and his eminence in the general community is a good indication of the relative ease with which Jews could cross into the civic world of early Cape Town. One of the major reasons being the legislative freedom of religion that the British had inherited from the Batavian Republic. Saul did convert to Anglicanism along with his brother, but maintained a strong connection with the practicing Jewish community, attending Passover Seders and other festivals, as well as a strong friendship with the new rabbi, Reverend Joel Rabinovitz. A willingness to convert in order to better assimilate into formal society was comparatively prevalent amongst Anglo-German Jews who came of age in the wake of the Emancipation and the Enlightenment. In South Africa, it did occur from time to time, but could never be tagged as a dominant or preferable choice. More Jews were simply non-practicing, and the arrival of the more intensely religious Eastern European immigrants meant it became an exception apart from the later landlords, who saw it as their way to finally break through from their upper middle class existence into the headier realm of the aristocracy. They also saw it as good business practice. By that stage, though, anti-Semitism had become a public expression and more overt. But in the earlier story of Jewish South Africa in the Cape Colony, being Jewish was no real hindrance to being part of civic life. As small villages became towns and the British colonial government instituted the structures of British civil administration, Jewish names cropped up with great regularity as municipal councillors, justices of the peace, and members of parliament. There was also a surprising presence of Jews in the military, particularly in the early defense of border towns. The first Jewish mayor of Cape Town was Hyman Lieberman, a distinction he achieved no less than 3 times. Born in Poland and raised in England, he nevertheless retained the thick Yiddish accent even as he swore his oath of office. He maintained his position within the Jewish community while he served the Cape Town City Council, being a warden and sometime president of the Cape Town Hebrew Congregation. When he died, his funeral procession was one of the longest ever seen in this city as it wound its way through the streets of the city bowl. Isaac Bowman, who holds the distinction of being the first Jew in Bloemfontein, became so entrenched in civic affairs that when his daughter married, a public holiday was declared to enable President Brunt and his Volksraad, or Parliament, to attend the wedding. A similar story can be found in the establishment of the Johannesburg Township, but there the Jewish community was in at the ground floor. By the way, another town in South Africa can claim literal Jewish roots alongside Joburg. One of the biggest railway junctions in South Africa is situated at De Aar, which started as a farm belonging to the Friedlander brothers, who bought the trading concession to the railway construction site and built an hotel and a trading store. Apart from some time in the hands of the military during the Anglo-Boer War, the hotel, eventually renamed the Hotel De Aar by proprietor Abraham Radomski, is a perfect example of the Jewish country hotels that could be found the length and breadth of the country. Why was the hotel industry of South Africa so much the preserve of the Jewish community, beginning with the first boarding houses in District 6 and ending with the international hospitality empire of Sol Kerzner? Was it because of a tradition of hostelry and innkeeping amongst the immigrants from Eastern Europe, or can we trace it back to the very beginning and the hospitality Abraham offered his visitors? I'll have the gefilte fish. Whatever the reason, Jewish travelers throughout the country could always be assured of a Hamish, if not necessarily completely kosher welcome, as they journeyed from place to place. And many a Boer or Brit had their first taste of chicken soup and knedlach at such establishments. Back to Johannesburg and the rise of the good civic burghers there. As the city expanded from a mining camp to a township, and from a township into a bustling town, and then a full-fledged city, and the largest one in South Africa at that, much of its development and expansion came from Jewish property developers. Barney Bernardo himself purchased large tracts of land with the express purpose of developing them for both residential and commercial purposes. But after his mysterious death at sea, they were ceded to the Johannesburg Consolidated Investment Company, which he had founded. Like most developing cities, the kernel, in this case, the area around Market Square, including Marshallstown and Ferreirastown, was developed outwards in a spiral. The Goldreich brothers joined with Emanuel Mendelssohn and went north, expanding settlement up the ridge of White Waters to create Hillbrow, which, once it became the high-rise magnet for Johannesburg apartment dwellers, was for a long time the most densely populated square mile in the Southern Hemisphere. To the east lay an extremely desirable swathe that included Doornfontein and Bez Valley, both once home of many a landlord mansion before Parktown Ridge became even more desirable. Beyond them was the area which Max Langerman bought up and turned into the suburb of Kensington, and it was there that he donated the ground for the first purpose-built Jewish orphanage. The Goldreich brothers spread further, developing Regent's Park and Wanderer's View, but one of the most impressive and long-lasting expansions remained the territory of one family. Whereas the names of Langerman and Goldreich are memorialized in street names, Leo Rosettenstein and his family are remembered in the name of an entire suburb, Rosettenville. Papa Leo also added Turfentine, Rosettenville Extension, and Kenilworth to the family portfolio, all to the south of Johannesburg city centre. Back in the old country, Jews had been denied property rights, but here such things as mortgages were available, and owning property was something that the new immigrants could aspire to. As Johannesburg developed, the Jewish community moved both physically and in status northeast from Doornfontein to Troyville and Yeoville, and from there to Berea, Mountain View, and Orange Grove, and then the heady heights of Houghton, where one could be said to have truly made it. In a directional reversal, Cape Townian Jews traveled from the city bowl to the grander southern suburbs, though a sizable community staked their claim on the Atlantic coast, making Sea Point a near Jewish neighborhood. And in terms of neighborhoods, Cape Town's District 6 was often described as the equivalent of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Time and the apartheid government's bulldozing of District 6 has virtually erased the traces of the District 6 Jewish presence, apart from a few buildings. In Johannesburg, the Doornfontein High Street, Byte Street, named for Sir Alfred Byte, was once a Jewish thoroughfare with Goldenberg's and Wachenheimer's butcheries and Crystal's bakery and numerous small shops, including the American ice cream factory. And a little further down the road, the Alhambra cinema screened Yiddish films like A Brivele de Mama and The Dibbuk. Contemporary Johannesburg has a few intersecting streets with fishmongers, butcheries, supermarkets, restaurants, and the like in the heart of the new Jewish shtetl, serving the kosher community, while Sea Point has but a few individual stores that can still be termed Jewish. London-born Sir Harry Grauman was the first Jewish mayor of Johannesburg, and his rise to that position was a remarkable story of enterprise and daring. He had arrived in South Africa as a teenager and found work with a wholesale company at a salary of 30 shillings a month, all found. As he said himself, at the end of the month, there was very little to find. He did some trading in ostrich feathers to supplement his salary and decided to become a commercial broker. He was so young, he was known as the boy broker, probably no more than 16 years old. After some successful trading in the Eastern Cape and Natal, he headed for the goldfields of the Transvaal, became the youngest stockbroker in Barberton. Thereafter, his rise was unstoppable, and he ended up on the Witwatersrand as a financier. Throughout the knotty complexity of the Anglo-Boer War, Harry was everywhere. As chairman of the War Refugee Committee in Cape Town, corresponding with and advising Lord Roberts in the Transvaal, and working towards reconciliation between Afrikaners and English speakers. He became deputy mayor in 1908, and the following year was unanimously elected mayor. His mayoral service was held at the Park Synagogue, with both Rabbi Landau and Rabbi Hertz officiating. Harry went on to initiate the building of the Johannesburg City Hall, the town council having met before its existence in a collection of corrugated iron buildings near the Park Synagogue, commonly known as the Tin Temple. He declined to serve a second term as mayor, received a knighthood in 1923, and eventually retired to Sea Point and died there just before the Second World War. Grauman's story and others like it may give the impression that public attitudes towards Jews in South Africa at that time were relaxed, accommodating, and generally welcoming. And in some instances, they were. But it should be remembered that Grauman's rise and that of similar notable public Jewish figures played out against a distressing coagulation of harsh, vocal anti-Semitism. Harry Grauman cut a fine figure in his mayoral robes and chain, but the most prominent Jew in the general population's mind was literally a caricature, a line drawing of a corpulent, hook-nosed, grasping plutocrat called Hoggenheimer, drawn by D.C. Boonzaier and published in the South African News. South Africans delighted in Hoggenheimer. He became the symbol for them of all the exploitative landlords, capitalists, and industrialists responsible for all the miseries and woes of their existence. But most of all, he was the symbol for them of all the greedy, heartless, and extortionate, funny-speaking foreign Jews. Though Boonzaier denied it, Hoggenheimer looked more and more like the equivalent anti-Semitic caricatures that were to be found across Europe and North America, and would reach their apotheosis in Der Stürmer, the Nazi propaganda newspaper. The shift from warm and welcoming perceptions of the Jew amongst the rural Afrikaners, the people of the book, their history reflects ours, to a competitive rivalry and distrust centered on the build-up to the Anglo-Boer War. In particular, it finds focus on the Uitlanders, literally foreigners, or those from outside the land. These were all the foreigners who came to South Africa after the Dutch occupation, and by the waning decades of the 19th century, the term was specifically applied to those foreigners who came to the Boer republics in pursuit of mineral wealth and adventure. The second wave of Jewish immigration formed a sizable percentage, though the vast majority were of British origin. Among the Uitlanders were those who were supportive of British imperialist aspirations. Barney Bernardo was one, and there were those who were supportive of Boer nationalism. Remember Sammy Marks? The landlords were perceived as being strongly in the British camp, and by the time the whole messy farrago of the Jameson raid happens, the idea that the mining magnates and capitalist financiers were responsible for the push towards war takes hold amongst the Afrikaner nationalists. And since many of the magnates and financiers were Jewish or of Jewish origin, the old canard of international Jewish capitalism being responsible for this and other wars finds acceptance. Yet there were Jews who fought on the side of the Boer commandos and served with distinction. Joseph Jackal Siegel and Wolf Jacobson were not only loyal to the Boer cause, they were bitter einders and fought with them to the bitter end. In the shadow of the Boer War lies another remarkable South African Jewish story. Mohandas K. Gandhi, best known as the Mahatma, began his political life in South Africa as an activist on behalf of the Indian population. He arrived in South Africa as a young lawyer to represent a local Indian businessman, but his observation of the experience of the Indian community led him to the fight for their rights and against their treatment by the British colonial authority, particularly the pass laws, as well as their restricted immigration. And it all happened at the same time as the Jewish community was engaged in its immigration struggles. Like the Jewish Ambulance Corps of Johannesburg during the Anglo-Boer War, Gandhi formed an Indian Ambulance Corps in which he served, and it was subsequent to the war that he formulated his passive resistance principles of satyagraha, which attracted admirers and followers, including a small, dedicated group of Jews. As he himself wrote, in South Africa, I was surrounded by Jews. That's Gandhi, Sonia Schlesinger, and Herman Kallenbach. Among them was his partner in his law firm, Henry Pollack, as well as Henry's wife, Minnie, and Sonia Schlesinger, who raised funds for the Satyagrahi and organized food and other support when many of them were imprisoned. Gandhi's closest friend was Herman Kallenbach, a Jewish architect who had emigrated to South Africa from Germany. The two even shared this house in Orchards, Johannesburg, which Kallenbach had designed specifically for Gandhi. Kallenbach and Gandhi shared many ideas and hosted discussion groups at the house, which was where Gandhi did much of his writing, with Sonia serving as his secretary. Kallenbach, who also shared his interest in the writings and philosophy of Leo Tolstoy, donated his farm property outside Johannesburg as a home for the followers of Gandhi who had limited means. Known as Tolstoy Farm, Gandhi lived there for a while, as well as Kallenbach, who designed a school that was built on the property. Kallenbach sailed with Gandhi to England, but when the First World War broke out, he was detained as an enemy alien because of his German birth and interned on the Isle of Man, thwarting his plans to be with Gandhi on his return to India. He sailed back to South Africa and continued his work as an architect, all the while maintaining their correspondence. When Hitler began his rise to power, Kallenbach became an ardent Zionist and supporter of the kibbutz movement, and he was asked to elicit Gandhi's public support for a Jewish national homeland. On this, the two great friends disagreed, because Gandhi felt the Jews of Germany should counter Hitler's policy with the principles of Satyagraha. Despite this gulf between them, their friendship and correspondence continued until Kallenbach's death in 1945. Hermann Kallenbach left the bulk of his estate to Israel and his library to the Hebrew University. He is buried on Kibbutz Degania in the Galilee. Kallenbach's story is an indication of how diverse opinions and allegiances were within the South African Jewish community. It's very easy to look back and regard it as a monolithic unit, and it may in fact have been regarded as such by the general South African society, but the reality was very different. From divergent religious viewpoints and practices to community disagreements over representation and authority, the Jewish community was large enough and flexible enough to sustain an impressive variety of attitudes and beliefs, particularly when engaging with the greater civil society and the body politic. The strong and historic connection of a section of the Pale of Settlement Jews with the rising labor movement and socialist politics stuttered somewhat in South Africa. For one thing, when the immigrants arrived here, they found the position of laborers more than adequately filled by the indigenous population. The Jewish workers were always going to be elevated at least one class above by virtue of their skin color, whether they aspired to this or not. While there were certainly Jewish tailors and seamstresses and milliners, for example, we never had the sweatshops and Jewish worker, Jewish boss conflict that was so much a part of Lower Manhattan in the United States. In Cape Town, there was a brief swell of cooperatives and union-like labor organizations that attempted to protect some Jewish workers who were tailors and carpenters and bakers, but they soon disappeared or lost their identity as they were absorbed into largely British unions that were represented in the Cape Colony. It was in Cape Town, too, that a branch of the Socialist Bund was established, but it too disappeared. Early Johannesburg could boast such specific proto-unions as the Jewish Cab Drivers Association and a few Jewish tailors' guilds. These were also absorbed by the larger unions of British origin when they arrived and were, of course, whites only. It was again the threat of immigration restrictions and quotas that pushed many Jews towards the South African Labour Party, and some rose to the forefront, including Charles Klingman, who became party secretary in 1914. The following year, a branch of the International Socialist League was established in Johannesburg. It became so popular that within the year it began to publish its documents, flyers, and broadsheets in Yiddish, as well as English and Nederlands. And let's not forget that when the accounts of the Tsar's abdication made their way to the mining town, there were riotous celebrations where Jews, quote, danced in the streets, unquote. The Yiddish Arbeiter Club sustained the fight for workers' rights at the same time it waved the banner for its cultural activities and Yiddishist founding principles. Its own newsletter was called the Proletarische Stimme, the proletarian voice. Many of its members became founders of the South African Communist Party, and from their ranks came two significant trade unionists. Solly Sachs was born in a Lithuanian shtetl and came to South Africa in 1914. He lived with his family in Malay Camp, a deprived slum area in Greater Johannesburg, where they endured sustained hardship. Since he lived there and worked in a concession store in this multiracial settlement, Sachs grew up witnessing both racial and worker discrimination. And his path through socialism into the Communist Party was assured. Eventually, He became the General Secretary of the Garment Workers' Union. Paradoxically, the Garment Workers' Union members were for the most part white Afrikaner women who were being assiduously courted by Afrikaner nationalists. But Solly kept these female workers within the union camp by establishing an individual branch for mixed-race members. When the National Party came to power in 1948, they systematically targeted the Communist Party, and Solly was eventually banned under the Suppression of Communism Amendment Act in 1952. He elected to go into exile in Britain. And for those of you who don't know, Solly was the father of Albie Sachs, himself an activist and later Justice of the Supreme Court of the new democratic South Africa. Ray Alexander was born in Latvia, in a small town where her father was a teacher and ardent socialist. She joined the communist underground there at a very young age, but her mother sent her to study in Lithuania, mindful of the strong level of anti-Semitism at the Latvian universities. Fearing her imminent arrest because of her political activities, Ray, born Rochel, was sent to South Africa to join her brother and sister, but within a week of landing had joined the Communist Party here. Like Sachs, she became the Secretary General of a union, in this case a multiracial one, the Food and Canning Workers Union of the Western Cape. She too was banned as a communist repeatedly. As one order expired, another was instituted. She stood for parliament as a native representative. Blacks were barred from the legislature by the apartheid laws, but were allowed limited representation by a few token white members. But on election, she was barred from parliament and not allowed to take her seat. In fact, she was physically pushed down these stairs by an over-enthusiastic policeman. She had married Jack Simons, an academic at Wits University who was also served with a banning order and prevented from teaching. In the face of sustained harassment by the authorities, the two elected to go into exile in Zambia. Jews had been elected to the colonial legislatures in the Cape and Natal, but the constitution of Kruger's South African Republic forbade the franchise and election to the Volksraad to anyone who was not a professed Calvinist. After union in 1910, a small but significant representation from the Jewish community sought election to the Union Parliament. By 1915, there were 5 Jewish representatives, including one who stood as a National Party candidate, and in the 20s, there were 7 major Jewish representatives elected to Parliament, including Morris Alexander and Morris Kentridge. A pact between the Labour Party and the Nationalist Party and dissatisfaction with Smuts over the Rand Revolt led to JBM Hertzog becoming Prime Minister in 1924. 6 years later, this government tabled and passed the Immigration Quota Act, which effectively throttled Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, making the distinction between desirable and undesirable immigrants, which was entirely dependent on their country of origin. The link between most South African Jews and their country of origin was thus severed. For the next decade, the engagement of the Jewish community with civil society around them would be overshadowed by increasingly strident anti-Semitism. In a reflection of what was happening in Europe, and because of the complex history of deepening antipathy between Afrikaner nationalism and British imperialism, it was almost inevitable that fascist groups supportive of Hitler and the Nazi Party would make their appearance in South Africa. The effects of the Depression were felt by nearly all South African society, but in Afrikaner nationalist eyes, Jewish capitalist interests were responsible for the plight of poor whites and particularly poor Afrikaners. First came the Landsgruppe Suid-Afrika, formed at the University of Cape Town, no less. More significant was the establishment of the South African Gentile and National Socialist movement with its headquarters in Cape Town, but with branch representation across the country. The members were soon referred to as the Grey Shirts. This was the time of die Joodse Vraagstuk, the Jewish question. It was a question that was increasingly and openly asked on the streets, in the newspapers, and here in Parliament. The question was inherited from Europe and had been asked in many forms. In essence, it asked what to do about the Jews and what was their position in society and how could their encroaching presence be controlled. In Parliament, the answer was the increasingly restrictive bills pertaining to immigration. But in the plethora of Afrikaner nationalist groups like the Grey Shirts, the answer was picketing, demonstrations, and a torrent of openly anti-Semitic leaflets and handbills. The measure of sympathy Jews may have felt for the Afrikaner cause, in which some thought paralleled the Jewish national aspirations, soon evaporated. Afrikaner support for Zionism also faded, as Afrikaner society increasingly identified with the German cause, particularly in their ongoing struggle with Britain. The Jewish community tried to counter the increasingly hostile atmosphere through an appeal to the civil courts. When the Grey Shirts claimed to have uncovered material that proved the existence of an international Jewish conspiracy, a thinly disguised variation on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Jewish Board of Deputies decided that they could make a case for libel, since the document was purportedly signed by the rabbi of the synagogue in which the document was supposedly found. The trial was held in the Grahamstown division of the Supreme Court, and the court found in favor of the prosecution, denouncing the documents as insidious forgeries. One of the details that helped prove the board's case was Hebrew lettering, printed on some of the pages. They read, Kosher LePesach, suitable for Passover. Clearly, the forgers had no idea of their meaning. The government of South...
All right, I'll have a little break. I think if there are any little questions and things you'd like to answer, you'd like to ask. As you see that there's now quite a lot of political involvement happening, and also lots of anti-Semitism that's emerging, which is basically still reflected today. But the Jewish community are now really engaged in South African society, and they really are reflecting on the terrible situation that many of them came from, the pogroms, the exiles, and they see the situation where their fellow South Africans now, particularly the Black community, are being really discriminated against, and they're forming sort of socialist organizations, trade union organizations, to really try and counter what is happening politically. And this now obviously leads up to people like Helen Suzman. Are there any questions or answers that people would like to discuss?
Okay, let's go on, and maybe people can join the discussion at the end. Thank you, Mark, for coming in and giving us a little insight. Thank you.
Yeah, things are really changing now in the country. So you can see we're going forward, and the war era, between World War I and World War II, South Africa really is changing drastically.
It had changed once more since Smuts and Herzog had formed a union between their respective South African Party and National Party. The United South African National Party was known by most as the United Party. But where did that leave D.F. Malan, Herzog's deputy? He broke away to form a purified National Party. Initially, his opposition was to future Jewish immigration, not the already present Jewish community. But under his leadership, his party soon began to voice opinions in favor of the expulsion of the Jews and suggesting an alliance of the English and Afrikaners as a united Nordic front against them. The Grey Shirts may have had to lick the wounds inflicted by the Supreme Court judgment, but they didn't go away and continued recruiting members. In 1938, the Afrikaner community celebrated the centenary of the Great Trek, the mass Boer migration from the Cape to the interior, with a reenactment that culminated in Pretoria, where the foundation stone of the Voortrekker monument was laid. Ostensibly cultural in nature, the celebration had some sinister offshoots, including the formation of a group known as the Ossewa Brandwacht, the Oxwagon Sentinel. Its paramilitary structure echoed that of the Nazi brown shirts and was further cemented by its later offshoot called the Stormjagers, the Stormtroopers. All of this was of deep concern for the Jews of South Africa, who sought ways of countering the intensifying anti-Semitism among the Afrikaner nationalists. D.F. Malan tried to veil the increasingly anti-Jewish platform of the Purified National Party, declaring that its intentions were misinterpreted. At the same time, Eric Lowe, long an aggressive enemy of the Jewish community, had no such qualms and tabled a private member's bill to deprive immigrants of any rights to naturalization. Many of his bill's proposals were modeled on the Nuremberg laws, including definitions of Jewish identity and the restriction of occupations and trades. It should be pointed out that a segment of the Jewish community suggested in the 30s that perhaps Jewish immigration to South Africa should be suspended to mitigate the strident anti-Semitism they were facing. They thought that in this way they might placate the fears of the general white population of the country. The declaration of war by the British government in 1939 upended the politics of South Africa. Despite his coalition partners' endorsement and support of neutrality, Smuts narrowly won the parliamentary vote for the Union of South Africa to enter the war on the side of Great Britain.
So there was something I meant to mention earlier, and I hope you don't mind me cutting in quickly. Alan mentioned a court case where the Ossewa Brandwacht brought charges against the Jewish community and accused them of this world domination ideology that we hear so often about. So what actually happened is that the Ossewa Brandwacht members broke into the Port Elizabeth shul, and there was a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was essentially, we all know, it's complete fabrication. But they held this up and they took the Jewish community to court and they accused them, and they said this book, the Elders of Zion, proved that Jews wanted to dominate the world, and in particular they wanted to dominate South Africa, and they wanted to take over all the industry, and obviously the Afrikaners would be most affected. And what ultimately happened is that went to court, and this was the first circumstance where the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was actually debunked in a legal court. And although it was done, the same court case was repeated a year later. I think it was in Switzerland, but this was the first time that someone had ever brought it up into the law, and to prove that it was a falsified document, and it was just pure anti-Semitism. And in fact, Gail has introduced me to a friend of hers, and it was her great-grandfather who was the rabbi at that shul. And I believe she's written a doctoral thesis about that particular court case in her great-grandfather's life. And that is also one of the ideas I have as a follow-up documentary series. I think it'll be very, very interesting, especially in terms of what it is. I mean, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is still woven around to prove that the Jews want to own the world. And obviously it was proved in the 1930s that it was completely a fabrication.
Herzog immediately resigned and crossed the floor to the nationalists, who renamed themselves the Reunited National Party. The Afrikaner nationalists allied the movement more and more with Nazi Germany. The Jewish community enthusiastically supported Smuts and threw themselves into the war effort. At this stage, the members of the community who were eligible for military service were mostly South African born, and memories of the British support of Tsarist Russia had receded into the past. More than 10% of the Jewish population joined up and marched off to war, seeing service in the various branches of the Defense Force and its support wings. On the home front, the community busied itself with relief organizations such as the Jewish War Appeal, which coordinated its efforts with the American Joint Distribution Committee, the equivalent arm of United States Jewry. The Joint Distribution Committee directed its attention to the plight of refugees from the very beginning, and the majority of the South African Jewish War Appeal's efforts were similarly channeled. Many of the women's guilds attached to the synagogues across the country formed committees to send assistance and comfort parcels to Jewish servicemen. As part of the Union Defense Force, most South African Jewish servicemen saw action in North Africa as some of the so-called desert rats, and many were interned after the fall of Tobruk. Others saw service in the Middle East, while yet others formed part of the Allied invasion of Italy and fought in the Anzio campaign and the Battle of Monte Cassino. Joe Slovo was one of the contingents who were based for some time in Italy. The Jewish soldiers were well served by a contingent of Jewish chaplains, and synagogue services were held in the makeshift accommodations, though there were a few purpose-built constructions, particularly in North Africa. The senior chaplain of the British Army was Louis Rabinowitz, who saw service in the Middle East too. Shortly after his demob at the end of the war, he was appointed the new chief rabbi of South Africa. While on active service, the Jewish holidays, where possible, were also observed, and one Essie Silberman described a Pesach Seder held in the open air under an Egyptian sky as particularly memorable for obvious reasons. He referred to the Knedlach as rubbery, though, but Jewish debate about the quality of Knedlach has been a long-standing one, and it's yet to be resolved. In this instance, the servicemen were compensated by having matzot and wine from neighboring Palestine, especially brought in for their Seder.
It started after the First World War, around about 1921. It wasn't known as the Jewish Ex-Service League then. And after the Second World War, it became the South African Jewish Ex-Service League. And most of its members, of course, were members or veterans from the Second World War. And unfortunately, it's getting smaller and smaller because it's many years since the end of the Second World War. There is a South African Jewish National War Memorial at West Park Cemetery, and the South African Jewish Ex-Service League hold a memorial service there every year on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we have plaques on this memorial, which incidentally is in the shape of a wall. And it's supposed to represent the Kotel, the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And we have plaques there for the First World War and with names, Second World War, the Israeli wars, the border wars. And we have two empty spaces, but with a plaque that one reads the unknown soldier, because we have that there in case we've left out a name. We honor the unknown soldier, and we have another plaque for the Holocaust victims.
One of the most notable airmen during the Second World War was Cecil Margot, who had trained as an Air Force pilot while studying for his law degree. He served in the South African Air Force, flying missions in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. After flying 190 missions, he was given the command of the 24th Bomber Squadron. He was awarded both the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross, and was requested to lead the VE Day flypast over Vienna of 1,000 Allied aircraft. He returned to his legal practice after the war, but was personally requested by David Ben-Gurion to be chief advisor on the formation of the Israeli Air Force. Though he was offered the position of commander of the new Air Force, Margot returned to South Africa to his wife and family and rose in the legal ranks here, taking silk as a Queen's Counsel, and eventually was appointed a Justice of the Supreme Court. Back home, Jewish involvement in the war effort continued. In Durban, one of the great community institutions and a source of pride was the Durban Jewish Club, situated in a custom-designed building on Old Fort Road. The club facilities were placed at the disposal of the Union Defense Forces, and the canteen and rest and relaxation facilities were provided by the Union of Jewish Women and the Durban community to all servicemen and women, regardless of religious affiliation. Durban was the port of embarkation for those serving up north, as well as a stop for Allied convoys sailing to the Far East, and the club facilities were stretched beyond their capacity, with no one turned away. By the end of 1941, more than 47,000 meals had already been served, and since the cooking was handled by the women of the Jewish community, many a non-Jewish soldier or sailor had their first taste of Jewish food at the club canteen. By the war's end, and with the club returned to the community, it was finally totted up that over 2 million members of the armed forces had passed through the doors, and 750,000 meals served. The club and the community were officially commended by Field Marshal Smuts for their war effort. It still functions as a Jewish center for the Durban community today. The horror of the fate of European Jews began filtering through to the South African community early in 1941. The Board of Deputies had not stopped defending the South African community against the anti-Semitic provocations of Osama Brandtwag, but in 1940, they had to contend with a new openly pro-Nazi party, Die Nuwe Orde, or New Order, founded by Oswald Pirro. Attempts at alerting the general population to the German atrocities were met by denials from Afrikaner nationalists, though some Christian clergy and non-Jewish leaders addressed mass meetings, expressing their dismay and protesting Nazi actions. In 1942, the Jewish Board of Deputies began a series of official days of mourning for the Jews of Europe. Special synagogue services were held around the country, and Jewish businesses closed to allow for the expression of grief and protest in community gatherings. In addition, the board lobbied again for the relaxation of the immigration restrictions that blocked the chance of any Jewish refugees being allowed in. Smuts gave as his reasons for maintaining the restrictions that transport to South Africa was serving the armed forces, and the resources of the country, including food supply, were mobilized for the war effort. Above all, he stated that an influx of Jewish refugees would exacerbate the already heightened expressions of anti-Semitism in the country.
I'd just like to add a point in here. There was a limitation of 50 Jews a year who were allowed into South Africa during World War II. Even though the situation in Europe was terrible and most of them were trying to flee, and there were refugees around the world. And what happened to, I mentioned earlier, my wife's Safari family, when they arrived here, they were also restricted by the quota system, and they ended up going into Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe. And there was a big Sephardi community there for a while. Some of them started leaving in the 60s. There are very few left there now. But the Sephardi community were very, very small in South Africa, and they weren't really that influential, but they were quite different to the existing community of Jews who either started off as being British or German or Litvaks from Eastern Europe, These were now Mediterranean Jews, completely different. They spoke Ladino, which is a combination of Hebrew and Spanish. Their diet was quite different, their traditions are different, and they even opened their own synagogues.
During the early years of the war, a kind of soldiers' union had been formed in North Africa amongst the South African servicemen, with Jock Isaacowitz as one of its leaders. It became known as the Springbok Legion, and although short-lived, its initial activities attracted the attention and support of many of the Jewish servicemen and women. Strongly anti-fascist and anti-racist, it had amongst its leadership Joe Slovo, Lionel Bernstein, Wolfie Kodesh, and Harry Schwartz. Later, it would give rise to a further offshoot, the Torch Commando, which would play an important role in the politics of South Africa in the 50s. By the war's end, the attention of the local Jewish community was focused on the destruction of European Jewry and on whatever support and help the community could muster. Concern for the fate of Jewish refugees and the reunification of surviving family members led to renewed lobbying of Smuts' government for relaxation of the immigration laws. This was not to be. Between 1946 and 1948, a total of 1,512 Jewish immigrants were allowed into the country. Smuts held fast to his belief that the Jewish refugees would be better served by going to Palestine, and his government maintained that the absorption of any more immigrants would place a strain on the already overburdened economy in the wake of the war. Direct Jewish involvement in government and civil affairs continued, despite some disagreement from distinct sections of the Jewish community. Bertha Solomon, who had won her parliamentary seat in 1938 as a member of the United Party, continued her lobbying on behalf of women and children. At the war's end, South Africa gained its first Jewish cabinet minister, Dr. Henry Gluckman, who was appointed Minister of Health. From Siegfried Frankl onward, South African Jewish medical professionals have consistently engaged with the general community health all the way into the present day.
The connection begins if we go back to Maimonides, who we consider the father of Jewish medicine, who grew up in Cordoba in a society of excellence with interaction between the Muslim and the Christian world, who felt that you needed to go and look after your fellow man. And this is something that the communities, wherever they've gone around the world, have been concerned about their fellow man. The stalwart in terms of community medicine was two people. It was a husband and wife couple. It was Sidney Clark and his wife, Emily Jaspin, who were Wits graduates. And they got involved in the research of what they called Bantu nutrition. That was the term they used in those days, where they did surveys looking at children in the Black communities and then their nutritional status. And they then set up a center called Polela in rural Natal, which became the model that was advocated for national health insurance by Dr. Henry Gluckman, who was the Minister of Health under the Smuts government. And he was the one who spoke about implementing national health insurance. The Clarks set up this amazing center. They then went to Natal University, where they set up the Institute of Family Medicine. And they were the mentors for a number of people who would become world experts in terms of community or public health. Unfortunately, because of the politics at the time, they had to leave the country. They went to the US and they went on to Israel. And there at the university in Jerusalem, they set up community medicine. A couple they influenced was Mervyn Sassa and his wife, Zena Steyn. Both Wits graduates who'd gone to work with them in Natal as students, and they came to Alexandra Clinic here in Johannesburg to work again, because of the political situation, they left and they ended up as professors at Columbia University, professors emeritus in epidemiology and xenostay, and also in psychiatry. They were involved in setting up a research center in KwaZulu-Natal in Richards Bay. So we've now seen a cycle of people who in the 1930s and 40s, their impact has been felt today in terms of South African medicine.
For a while, there was an unexpected confluence of Zionist and South African politics in the dealings of the community with the government as they lobbied for Smuts to apply pressure on the British government to ease the blockade on British-mandated Palestine. Newly appointed Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz railed against the British government over its mandate policies in his sermon at the service of Thanksgiving after VJ Day. The Grey Shirts and the New Order had ostensibly disbanded after the war, though the Afrikaner nationalists responded to the Allied victory by trying to raise awareness of the suffering of the Germans and further ignored the evidence of the Holocaust. There was still strong antipathy towards the Jewish community from the nationalists, though the aggressive anti-Semitism of the late 30s was muted in the immediate post-war period. As the issue of mandated Palestine moved towards international deliberation, the South African Jewish community was surprised by the measure of sympathy and support that was being shown towards the Zionist cause by the Afrikaner nationalists. Most of this support was still linked to the implacable resentment against Britain that was a result of the Anglo-Boer War. In a clear-cut example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the Afrikaner nationalists would support anything that would bring the British government discomfort. Within the National Party, Eric Lowe still clung to an anti-Jewish policy, though Malone differed with him and eventually issued a statement moderating the party's anti-Semitic stance and claiming that anti-Jewish opinions were not policy. Instead, the nationalists were simply holding to their anti-immigration commitment. Asked if there were anti-Semites in the party, he replied that the answer was yes, but no more so than in Smuts's United Party. And as the election approached, it seemed that most of South African Jews were inclined to the United Party. 1948 brought two major events to the South African Jewish community. One was a source of hope and pride, the other a source of fear and discomfort. In quick succession, the State of Israel was proclaimed, and in a surprise victory, the National Party won the general election in South Africa.
So, obviously the next series you can see it continues on from there. But there was something I wanted to mention earlier about the Ossewa Brandfach as well. There's a military historian at Stellenbosch University called Everett Kleinhans. And he's done a book based on extensive research. It's called Hitler's South African Spies. And one of the characters who you saw, there was a photograph of him called Roby Leibrand, and was a South African boxer, and he represented South Africa at the 36 Olympic Games in Berlin. And he was recruited, they didn't have to twist his arm, to really join the Nazi party. And he was sent back to South Africa to create the spy network on behalf of the Nazis. And what they did, they were spying from South Africa, they were spying on the Allied troops, their movement past the Cape, and then reporting it back to the Nazis on what they were doing. And the group became really quite effective at one stage. They set up eventually a message service from the Cape to Freiburg Freiburg to Mozambique, and then Mozambique onto Germany. They were all eventually arrested, but the National Party found it rather inappropriate to put them into jail. So they got away with it. But it's a very little known story about the sympathy between Osipar Brandtwag and the Nazis. And you can see how there was that influence, anti-West, anti-British influence that was in effect during World War II. Sorry, I thought I just had to have the little say.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for this amazing film, you know, putting things so clearly and finding such relevant images and videos to illustrate things that we sort of lived through, but were not really, maybe not really so conscious of. If anybody'd like to make any comments or say something, please raise your virtual hand if you could. Or Rochelle, I see you've got a hand. You need to unmute yourself so you can talk, please. I'll come to you, Alex.
No.
Yes. Now you've muted yourself. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes.
It was very, very interesting indeed, and I thank you, Mark, for the talk. I was particularly delighted to see that my uncle, my mother's brother, Sidney Clark, and his wife were discussed quite extensively, and I was very proud of that bit, and I had to mention that.
Thanks.
Naomi Rappaport is a very well-known physician, and her interest actually is now very much in the military. And I think from Gail, Gail's mentioned that she's living part-time in Israel these days doing military research, which is quite interesting. But she's very knowledgeable. But she and her husband essentially live in Victory Park.
Thank you. Alex Klein, did you want to say something? Please unmute.
Yeah, and I'm so fascinated and I'm learning things all the time. So thank you so much. It seems like history repeats itself wherever Jews go, and South Africa is no different, you know, trying to assimilate and push themselves into a community, build themselves up, and to get status, then to be blown down or to be thrown out, and then try to build themselves up again, and so on and so forth. So assimilation seems to be the common denominator in places where Jews want to have power. In your opinion, is this a good thing, or over assimilation is a bad thing and history repeats itself and shows this? I'm slightly confused.
You know, Alan raised an interesting issue in one of the episodes, and I can't remember which it is, and I think it applies to Jews around the world, is, are we South African Jews or Jewish South Africans? And I think it's how you approach that and how you think about it. So I know at present in South Africa, you know, since October the 7th, the community has become quite divided, but only divided by a fringe group who seem to be sympathizing with the wrong side. But Jews, I think, have always found it necessary to assimilate, being in such a small minority. And I think right towards the early part where Alan does mention, you know, a lot of South African Jews actually converted, you know, even the well-known landlords, you know, they would never have been knighted by the Queen for their ventures into gold and diamond mining, for example, and the amount of money they brought in for the crown, had they been Jewish. So they had converted, you know, even the Oppenheimers had converted to Christianity at some stage, even though I think the one off my head is Briss at Kimberley Shore, Geraldine.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, you know, it's
Harry Oppenheimer. He's in Bruce Records in Kimberley.
Yes, yes. So there was a lot of assimilation for economic and political ends. Whether that happens today or not, I don't know. I think it's just a case of people may just not be interested. You can see the shul attendance is very, very low these days. Whether it has to do with, Johannesburg having a Jewish community of 25,000, having 60 shuls, I don't know. There's a shul in every corner. So, but I think assimilation has been not necessarily losing the Jewishness, but assimilation. When my wife married me, I'm an Orthodox convert, and the Beth Din said to her, well, if you're a good Jewish girl, why did you marry out? And she said, well, she said I had to outsource. So whether that was appreciated by the Beth Din or not, I don't know. In fact, I know they didn't like it at all. But the Jewish community has always been very small. I think Durban only had a few thousand Jews. All the country communities, I think, in another issue that Rabbi Silverhoff brings up, the country communities are also very small. There may have just been a handful of Jews living around. And Alex, you did mention, I think, that the Jewish community was never more than 125,000. That wasn't you, Alex, it was one of the other guys who mentioned it. And today, I think the community is down to 45. So, of a population of 65 million people, 45, 50,000 Jews is a very, very small percentage.
Thanks, Mark. Gail, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. What I wanted to say was, thanks so much for the reference to Sydney and Emily Clark. And basically, they were amazing people because they really introduced family medicine, family practice in South Africa with a multidisciplinary approach, so that a patient would be, seen not only by a doctor, but by the multidisciplinary team of physiotherapist, dietitian, social worker, etc. And that was about to catch on in South Africa, as it has in Israel, with our Kupat Cholim. And Gluckman was at the head of all of that when the government changed and they decided that they wouldn't be giving equal health care to the blacks and to the whites, etc. Also, the general practitioners objected. They didn't really want a government system of medicine, but rather private practice so that they could make their own living and raise their families. And I just want to remind people, those of you who haven't seen it, there's a very interesting web exhibition on the Kaplan Center of the general practitioners in the northern suburbs, which we did a few years ago. There are 20 lives, biographies of general practitioners of the northern suburbs of the Cape, as well as 6 pharmacists, and an introduction which relates to Emily and Sydney Clark. And I've been in touch with their son, Ilan, who lives in Israel. They've made, very, very interesting documents and publications about this couple who were really quite incredible. So I think, yes, in terms of medical history of South African family practice, that was a really interesting time. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
And I think when we do later in the series, when we get to, I think it's episode, actually it's the next episode that we're going to be running, episode 6, where we talk about the professions. There's quite an extensive coverage on the medical practitioners who not only made a huge impact locally, but internationally in terms of developing both procedures and equipment for various forms of surgery. The medical field really was, Jewish medicine really produced, the Jews, within the medical industry in South Africa really produced some incredible things.
Absolutely. We did a survey of just 1 year of Wits graduates who graduated in medicine in 1960, of which there were 20 professors in a group of perhaps nearly 100 who graduated. In South Africa, in Australia, in America, in the UK, and that's just one tiny snippet in 1 year. You can see about that in the whole website under communities. There's under Johannesburg Wits graduates of 1960. So I think this has been a wonderful session. We've been introduced to so many things that we perhaps slightly knew about, and it's been brought into a great perspective. And thank you so much, Mark. And we're looking forward to the next session, which is at a different time of day, so that hopefully those people in Australia can connect to, because this time doesn't work for them. All the sessions will be recorded and will be on our presentations page on the whole website. Now, you can just remember what the website is, because it's CHOL.website. So www.chol.website. And there's lots of amazing stuff. There's stories, memoirs, communities, and, you know, things are happening all the time. Somebody wrote to me this morning who grew up in Mareersdorp or somewhere near Roodepoort, and has their family story. And somebody else contacted us about something else. So all the time this is growing and developing. And so thank you all for your interest, and do let your friends know who in Australia, for some reason, my emails to Australia are blocked. And so the people who even are on our list in Australia are not getting some of them are not getting the information. So if you have people you know in Australia, just please send them the links, the proper link, maybe not the Geraldine Auerbach one, but, you know, even that, I'm very happy to welcome many Geraldine Auerbachs. I wish there were more, because there's so many things I want to do. So it would be wonderful to spread the load amongst all our Geraldine Auerbachs here today. So thank you all for coming. And, you know, email me if you have any messages or things you'd like to communicate or ask Mark. And we're really looking forward to the next session, which is really getting down to the nitty-gritty of what South Africans have done and how much Jews who came to South Africa, you know, these tiny towns, and grew and flourished in a century and now have gone, you know, whether they've gone to Joburg or Cape Town or Toronto or London, New York, you know, just the people who are here today are an example of what's happened to this wonderful little community. And of course, it makes you think, what would the millions who were slaughtered have contributed to the world in terms of medicine, in terms of vaccinations, in terms of scientific discoveries? You know, I think we've made a contribution, shall we say. So thank you, and until next time, have a good day, have a good week, and see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, and please pass our thanks also to Alan.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I hope people found it very interesting. Some people have said it's really boring because they hate history, but I hope all of you did enjoy it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was found it boring, so there you are. So interesting, it says. Okay. Good. So see you next week then.